The sun was dropping low, spilling fire across the horizon when Elias McGraw first saw her. At 51, he thought he'd seen everything this country could throw at a man. Fire that ate through homesteads, drought that left cattle nothing but bones, neighbors who walked away from the land and never came back. But nothing in his long, weathered life looked like this. Out there, stumbling through the tall grass, was a figure that didn't belong to the living. For one wild second he thought she was a ghost, some spirit blown in on the wind. Her steps were uneven, her hair tangled like it had been torn by storms. And then, he heard it. Laughter. Not the light laugh of a girl full of hope, but the broken, jagged laugh of someone who had already lost everything. It cut the air like a knife. A dirty scrap of cloth clung to her shoulders, slipping lower with each desperate step. She gripped it tight, as though the rags were the last boundary between her and the world's cruelty. Elias froze on the trail, his horse shifting under him, ears flat with unease. A man could ride on, pretend he hadn't seen her. God knows the West was filled with stories better left untold. But something in the sound of that laugh, something raw, shattered, human, pulled him off the saddle before he could think. He stepped forward slowly, hand near the rifle on instinct, but his chest tightened as the truth came clear. She wasn't a spirit. She wasn't drunk. She was flesh and blood, no more than 24, her skin marked with bruises, streaked with dried blood. Her bare feet were torn open by the prairie. Her arms clawed raw as if she'd crawled through barbed wire. And then, those eyes. Hollow. Empty. Not begging, not fighting. As though the soul behind them had already slipped away. When she staggered against him, Elias dropped to his knees in the dust, catching her weight. His rough hands trembled as he steadied the cloth at her chest. That bitter laugh escaped her once more. Then came a whisper, fragile as smoke. I'm used goods. No kindness can change that. And for the first time in years, Elias McGraw had no words. Elias carried her as if she weighed less than the dust clinging to his boots. Truth was, she nearly did. Bones and bruises. That was all she was made of now, with some ragged thread of strength that had somehow dragged her across the prairie. He set her carefully across the saddle, steadied her limp body with one arm, and began the slow ride back through the falling dusk. The cabin appeared against the dying light. 4 walls of pine Elias had raised with his own hands, a roof patched so many times it still leaked in spring, and a fire that had never once failed him through the cold desert nights. Tonight, it had to keep her alive. Inside, he laid her down in the spare room, the one he'd always kept swept but never used. She did not fight him. She did not speak. Her eyes stared at the ceiling as if her spirit had flown far from her body, leaving only the shell behind. Elias brought a plate of beans and bread, set it near her hand, then stepped back. She never moved. The next morning, he tried again. Same food, same silence. By the 3rd morning, he understood this was no simple wound. Whatever had been done to her had carved deeper than flesh. He recognized the emptiness in her eyes. He had seen men on the trail, after storms and stampedes, stare into nothing just like that. Men who had lived through hell but left their souls behind. Most men would have given up, told themselves she was not their burden. They might have sent her back to town or left her to whatever fate had chased her into the wilderness. But Elias McGraw was not most men. He had lived too long with ghosts of his own making to abandon another soul to them. So he did what an old rancher knew best. He kept steady. Each day he cooked. He left clean water by the bed. He folded an extra blanket at the foot. He even placed one of his old shirts on the chair, the kind of shirt a working man wore until the fabric softened with sweat and sun. He did not know if she would ever touch it, but he left it there anyway, a quiet offering of a life that had nothing to do with cruelty. At night, as the desert wind howled around the cabin, Elias sat by the fire and wondered if she would last until morning. He thought of the way she had whispered, "I'm used goods." Those words haunted him. What kind of men had broken her so completely that she could see herself as nothing more than refuse? The thought clawed at his gut like rusted iron. On the 3rd day, something shifted. Elias came in quietly, same as always, expecting the same hollow stare. But her shoulders were no longer bare. She had wrapped herself in that old shirt. It hung loose on her frame, swallowing her thin body, but she had chosen it. Chosen not to stay buried in the filthy rags she'd arrived in. Her hand trembled as she reached for the bread. She chewed slowly, as if every bite cost her more than hunger itself. Elias said nothing, only stood nearby, watching as a spark of life flickered back into the ashes. Then, after days of silence, her voice came. Faint, fragile, barely more than a breath. "My name is Grace." It wasn't much, just a name, but to Elias, it was everything, the first crack of light through the storm. He nodded, but said nothing, because some words were too heavy to answer with speech. Instead, he stepped outside and split wood until his arms burned, the sound of each strike echoing through the hills like a vow. The days that followed were slow, heavy, but different. Grace did not speak much, but her eyes no longer drifted past him. She began to watch. She watched the way Elias chopped wood, the way he fed the horses, the way he poured coffee at dawn, watching like she was trying to remember what decent living looked like. And yet, the air in that cabin was never still. It carried tension, the kind that whispered of danger not yet gone. Elias could see it in the way Grace startled when coyotes howled at night, or when a lone rider's shadow crossed the distant ridge. He knew enough about men like Calder and his ilk to understand. If Grace had escaped them, they would come hunting. One evening, as Elias sat by the fire, Grace stirred from her silence. Her laugh came, soft, uncertain. She was watching his mule, a stubborn old beast, refuse to move from the corral no matter how many times Elias coaxed it. Her laugh wasn't bitter this time. It wasn't the broken sound that had first cut through the prairie wind. It was small, alive, and for Elias, it was the surest sign that the darkness had not claimed her completely. But peace on the frontier is never more than borrowed time. The dust on the horizon, the echo of hooves in the distance, they would come. And when they did, Elias knew the choice he had made, to stand between Grace and the men who wanted her back, would cost him more than beans, bread, or blankets. For now, though, the cabin stood. The fire burned. And Grace, though scarred, had spoken her name into the silence. And now I'll ask you this. If you were in Elias's place, would you have stayed by her side, feeding her every day when she gave nothing back? Would you have waited for that single word, that spark of life? Or would you have turned away, saying it was not your fight? If this story gripped you the way it gripped me, then hit that like button so more folks can hear it. Drop a comment if you believe no soul should ever be treated like property. And if you want to know what happens when the men who once owned Grace return to claim her, then make sure you subscribe, because the next chapter will test Elias McGraw more than any drought, fire, or gunfight ever could. The days passed heavy, weighted with silence that was no longer empty but tense, as though the air itself knew it was waiting for something to break. Grace had spoken her name, she had laughed once, but her body still trembled when the wind carried sounds from far across the prairie. Elias felt it too. Old instincts honed on the trail told him the calm would not hold. Peace was never meant to last long out here. That afternoon, the sun burned high, white and merciless. Elias was hauling water from the well, his shirt darkened with sweat, when his horse pricked its ears and stamped. Dust rose faintly on the horizon. A lone rider was coming down the trail. Even from a distance, Elias knew the kind of man who sat a saddle like that. Loose shoulders, chin tilted forward, eyes scanning like he owned the land. Trouble rode easy. Elias set down the bucket and waited. Grace was inside, sweeping the floor with slow, uncertain strokes of the broom. He didn't want her to see, but the cabin had windows, and she had learned by now to watch the world like a hunted animal. The rider pulled up at the gate, leaned back in his saddle, and spat into the dirt. His coat was too fine for any working man, trimmed in dust but stitched with money. The way his gaze slid to the house told Elias everything. He knew who was inside. "Name's mine," the stranger said, flatly, without even tipping his hat. "That girl don't belong here. She belongs back in Winslow." Elias's jaw tightened. He stood steady, one hand resting on the rail, the other brushing near the Winchester leaning against the wall. The man swung down, boots hitting earth with a thud, and swaggered up a step. You hiding her, old man? His smirk was sharp, cutting. You think a dried-up rancher like you can keep what ain't his? For a moment, the air stilled. The sound of cicadas, the creak of the barn door, even the wind seemed to wait. Elias finally spoke, his voice low but carved from stone. She belongs to no one. The man laughed, a cruel, jagged sound that carried across the yard. He took one more step toward the door, eyes glittering with hunger. That was when Elias moved. His hand snapped to the Winchester, the lever clicked, and the barrel rose to meet the man's chest in one clean motion. Silence fell harder than thunder. The rider froze, his grin faltering. He had expected fear, hesitation, maybe even a bargain. What he found was a man whose hands did not tremble, whose eyes burned with something older and harder than law. They stared at each other, two figures locked in a standoff as the desert sun poured over them. The horse stamped nervously, tossing its head, sensing the danger in the air. "You'll regret this," the rider muttered finally, stepping back slow. He mounted, jerking the reins, and turned his horse. "This ain't over." His words hung like smoke as he rode away, dust swirling behind him until the trail swallowed him whole. Elias lowered the rifle, but his grip stayed tight. His hands shook now, not from fear, but from fury. Fury that any man thought he could ride up and claim another human being as if she were cattle on the block. From the window, Grace had seen everything. Her face was pale, her body trembling, but her eyes carried something new. Not pleading, not despair. A spark, a fragile belief that maybe, just maybe, someone would stand for her. That night, Elias sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Grace sat in the next room, silent, but he could hear the uneven rhythm of her breathing. He wondered how long before more came. A man like that never rode alone for long. If he had spoken of Winslow, others would follow. The prairie outside seemed too quiet. Coyotes did not howl. Even the mule was restless, stamping in the corral. Elias kept the Winchester close, leaning against the hearth where he could reach it in the dark. Every sound, the groan of the beams, the crack of the fire, made him turn his head. When dawn broke, Elias stepped onto the porch, the desert light already sharp. The trail stretched empty, but he knew better. The rider's words had not been a threat. They had been a promise. Grace came to stand in the doorway, wrapped still in his old shirt. Her eyes met his, unsteady but clear. She did not speak. She didn't need to. Elias saw the fear there, the silent question. Will they come back? He nodded once, a grim line on his face. Yes, they would come back. And when they did, the ranch would no longer just be four walls of pine. It would be a battleground. Elias stepped down into the yard, boots crunching on dry earth. He tightened the fence rails, checked the barn doors, filled the water troughs. Every chore carried a new weight. This was no longer about keeping a ranch alive. It was about holding a line. The West was cruel. He had known that all his life. But that cruelty had always felt like nature. Drought, fire, flood. This was different. This was men. Men who treated life as property, who rode out with guns and chains. Men who believed the broken laugh of a woman was theirs to claim. As the sun climbed higher, Elias lifted his gaze to the horizon. The trail shimmered with heat. Somewhere out there, dust would rise again. And when it did, Elias McGraw would be waiting. The trail stayed quiet for 3 days after the stranger rode away. But Elias never believed in silence. Out here, quiet was only the pause before thunder. Each dawn he stepped onto the porch, Winchester close at hand, eyes scanning the horizon. Each night he sat by the fire with one ear tuned to the restless shuffle of the mule in the corral. Grace moved about the cabin in small ways, sweeping, feeding the chickens, folding blankets. But even her light steps carried tension. Both of them knew the storm hadn't passed. It was only circling. On the fourth morning, Elias heard it before he saw it. Hoofbeats. 3 sets this time, rolling across the dry earth like distant drums. He stood at the porch rail, rifle in hand. Grace froze in the doorway, her face pale, fingers clutched at the old shirt she wore like a shield. Dust rose on the trail. Two riders appeared first, pistols low on their thighs, eyes sharp and mean. Behind them came a heavier man, riding with the swagger of someone who had long ago forgotten what it was to earn respect. Elias's chest tightened. He knew that silhouette. Calder. Years ago, they had ridden the same cattle drives, slept under the same storm-split sky, driven herds across rivers so cold they thought their hearts would freeze. Once they had been young men chasing the same horizon. But time had carved them into opposites. Elias choosing solitude and land, Calder choosing power and cruelty. The riders pulled up at the gate, horses stamping, dust curling. Calder smirked as his eyes swept the ranch. "Still scratching out a living here, I see," he said, his voice rough as gravel. Then his gaze cut to the cabin. "But you've got something that doesn't belong to you. The girl. You know the one I came for." Elias stood steady, the rifle loose in his hands but ready. "She belongs to no one." Calder barked a laugh, ugly and dry. "That's where you're wrong. Men paid for her. And men don't like being cheated. You think you can hide her here like a stray dog?" The two riders flanked him, eyes flicking between Elias and the cabin, waiting for the order. The air went heavy, so still even the birds fell silent. Elias's voice was low, steady. "She stays." Calder leaned forward in the saddle, his smile thinned into a sneer. "Then you pay. Nothing comes free, old friend. You want to keep her? Give me that piece of land by the creek. You and I both know water's worth more than any woman." The words cut like steel. The creek land was Elias's lifeblood. Every season, every herd, every harvest had depended on that water. It wasn't just dirt and stream. It was legacy, sweat, the sum of all the years he had fought not to give up when neighbors walked away. For a moment, Elias said nothing. His jaw tightened, his hands gripped the rifle until his knuckles burned white. He would sooner let the sky itself fall than give Calder what he wanted. Then, light as a feather, desperate as a cry, a hand touched his arm. Grace. She had stepped out onto the porch, her bare feet against the boards, her voice trembling but clear. "If they take me back," she whispered, "they'll kill me." Her eyes met his. Wide, unflinching, not filled with tears but with terror so raw it made Elias's chest ache. It was the first time she had ever asked him for anything. Not food, not comfort, just life itself. Something inside Elias cracked. He looked at her, then back at Calder. The land was his blood, but what was land compared to a soul begging not to be thrown back into the fire? Slowly, Elias lowered the rifle. His voice was rough, breaking like a dry branch. "You take the creek land, but she stays." For a long moment, Calder studied him, eyes narrowed, testing if Elias meant the words. Then he spat in the dirt, laughed bitterly, and jerked his reins. "Always the fool with a soft heart," he muttered. With a signal, the two riders wheeled their horses. Dust rose as all three turned back down the trail, disappearing into the hard light of morning. Elias stood there long after the sound of hooves had faded, the rifle still in his grip. The yard felt emptier, the ranch smaller. He had given up the ground beneath his boots. He had traded his very blood. Yet when he looked back, Grace was leaning against the porch post, her shoulders shaking, not with fear, but with relief. Inside, the cabin seemed quieter than ever. Elias sat heavily by the fire, staring into the flames. His hands trembled, not from age, not from weakness, but from the weight of what he had lost. And yet, in the same trembling, he felt the faintest pulse of peace. Grace moved about the room softly, setting the broom aside, folding the blanket, lighting a small lamp. For the first time, she seemed present. Not drifting, not hollow, but here. Her silence was different now. It wasn't the silence of a broken spirit, but the silence of someone who knew they were still alive. Elias leaned forward, pressing his calloused hands together. He knew Calder would not forget. Men like him never left debts unpaid. The creek land was gone, and with it a piece of Elias's soul. But the woman standing behind him, the life he had saved, remained. And in the fragile hush of that moment, Elias McGraw understood the truth. Out here in the West, A man could lose everything: land, cattle, pride. But if he let another soul be dragged back into chains, he would lose something far greater: himself. The dust of Calder's departure still lingered in the air long after the hoofbeats faded. Elias stood on the porch, rifle slack in his hands, staring at the empty trail as if the land itself had been carved out from under him. The creek was gone. His blood, his sweat, the anchor of his ranch, all traded away in a single moment. Yet when he turned his head, he saw Grace leaning against the porch post, her shoulders shaking, not from fear, but from a fragile relief. And in that trembling silence, he understood. He had lost the land, but he had saved a life. Inside, the cabin felt smaller, quieter. Elias sat by the fire that night, his face shadowed in the glow. His hands trembled from the weight of sacrifice. Grace moved gently around him, laying out a blanket, tending to the lamp, the motions slow but sure. For the first time, she wasn't staring through the walls. She was here, in this place, in this moment. The next days carried a rhythm unlike any Elias had known in years. Grace began to move with purpose. She swept the porch at dawn. She fed the chickens with cautious hands. She even laughed softly one evening when Elias's stubborn mule refused to budge from the corral. That laugh, it wasn't the bitter, broken sound he'd first heard out in the prairie. It was different, softer, alive. A laugh that reminded them both that she was still here, still capable of something beyond pain. Elias said little. Words were never his way, but his silence no longer carried loneliness. Now it held something steadier, something like comfort. In the evenings, they sat together by the fire. Sometimes they shared bread, sometimes only the warmth of the flames. The cabin was still 4 walls of pine and a leaking roof, but for the first time, it felt less like a shelter and more like a home. Yet even in this fragile peace, Elias could not shake the truth. Calder was not a man to leave debts unsettled. He would drink on that creek water, he would smirk at the thought of victory, but men like him always came back for more. The land had been traded, but Grace's life remained a mark in Calder's ledger. And Elias knew it. The horizon did not lie still forever. Grace felt it too. She carried herself differently now, but her eyes still flicked to the windows when coyotes howled or when wind carried the sound of distant riders. She had lived too long under the weight of ownership, of being claimed, to believe safety was permanent. Her silence in those moments was heavy, filled with a fear that no land, no cabin, no rifle could erase completely. One night, as firelight flickered against the walls, Grace spoke words that silenced even the crack of burning logs. "You gave up your land for me," she whispered, her voice thin but steady. Elias lifted his eyes. "Land's only dirt and water. A man can lose it and still live." Her gaze didn't waver. "And if they come again?" Elias leaned forward, his rough hands clasped together, jaw set like stone. "Then I'll face them again." The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Grace closed her eyes, but her lips pressed together as though the answer was both comfort and curse. Days stretched into weeks. Grace's steps grew stronger. She carried buckets from the well, mended torn cloth with trembling fingers, and sometimes, when she thought Elias wasn't looking, she stood on the porch and let the wind brush her face, as though daring herself to breathe freely again. Each small act was a victory. Each smile a rebellion against the men who had tried to erase her. Elias watched all of it with a quiet awe he didn't speak. He saw the scars that lined her skin, the shadows that haunted her eyes, and yet, when he looked at her, he did not see what she had been forced to endure. He saw only the woman standing before him, stubborn enough to survive, brave enough to laugh again. And maybe that was what love truly was on the frontier. Not vows or rings or church bells, but 2 broken souls choosing day after day to stay. But peace was fragile. One morning, Elias heard it again, the sound of hooves, faint, distant, too many to count. He stepped onto the porch, Winchester in hand, his eyes narrowing toward the shimmering horizon. Dust was rising, carried on the wind like a warning. Calder was not finished. The line Elias had drawn, the sacrifice he had made, it was only the beginning. He tightened his grip on the rifle. Behind him, Grace stood in the doorway, framed by the shadow of the cabin. Their eyes met, steady and unflinching. Whatever storm was coming, they would face it together. Because out here in the West, a man's land could be stolen, his pride trampled, his blood spilled. But the moment he chose to stand for another soul, that was the moment no force on earth could take from him. The West had a way of stripping a man down to what he truly was. Some broke under its weight, others hardened until nothing human remained. But Elias McGraw had chosen another path, the hardest path of all. He had given away his most precious ground, not for gold, not for power, but for the chance that one shattered soul might live free. Every morning after Calder's departure carried a strange stillness. The Creekland was gone, a piece of his life carved out and handed over, yet in its place something fragile had taken root. Grace walked the porch now, her steps unsteady but real. She swept dust from the floorboards, gathered eggs from the hens, and sometimes allowed herself a small, fleeting smile when the stubborn mule balked at Elias's commands. Each act was more than a chore. It was proof that the world hadn't ended for her, not yet. Elias watched in silence, the same way he had always lived, but his silence no longer carried loneliness. It carried meaning. The sound of Grace's quiet laughter at dusk, the sight of her shoulders no longer shaking when the wind howled. These were victories greater than any herd driven across the plains. But even as hope stirred inside those four pine walls, the horizon was not empty. Calder had taken the land, but men like him never stopped at what they had. Sooner or later, he would return, dust rising behind him like a storm, demanding more. Elias knew it. Grace knew it. And yet, neither spoke of it. Because sometimes, the only way to live is to hold on to the peace you have in the moment, even when you know it may be ripped away tomorrow. So they sat together by the fire as the desert night fell. Two broken lives stitched together by choice, not blood, not law, but something older and truer. Grace carried scars on her body and in her heart. Elias carried the weight of years, of land lost, and battles still to come. And yet, when they looked at each other, they did not see ruin. They saw survival. And maybe that is the final truth of the frontier. That even when the land betrays you, when men circle like vultures, and when the past comes clawing back, you can still stand, you can still choose, and you can still save what matters most. Sometimes they shared bread, sometimes only the warmth of the flames. The cabin was still four walls of pine and a leaking roof, but for the first time, it felt less like a shelter and more like a home. Yet even in this fragile peace, Elias could not shake the truth. Calder was not a man to leave debts unsettled. He would drink on that creek water, he would smirk at the thought of victory, but men like him always came back for more. The land had been traded, but Grace's life remained a mark in Calder's ledger. And Elias knew it. The horizon did not lie still forever. Grace felt it too. She carried herself differently now, but her eyes still flicked to the windows when coyotes howled or when wind carried the sound of distant riders. She had lived too long under the weight of ownership, of being claimed, to believe safety was permanent. Her silence in those moments was heavy, filled with a fear that no land, no cabin, no rifle could erase completely. One night, as firelight flickered against the walls, Grace spoke words that silenced even the crack of burning logs. "You gave up your land for me," she whispered, her voice thin but steady. Elias lifted his eyes. "Land's only dirt and water. A man can lose it and still live." Her gaze didn't waver. "And if they come again?" Elias leaned forward, his rough hands clasped together, jaw set like stone. "Then I'll face them again." The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Grace closed her eyes, but her lips pressed together as though the answer was both comfort and curse. Days stretched into weeks. Grace's steps grew stronger. She carried buckets from the well, mended torn cloth with trembling fingers, and sometimes, when she thought Elias wasn't looking, she stood on the porch and let the wind brush her face, as though daring herself to breathe freely again. Each small act was a victory. Each smile a rebellion against the men who had tried to erase her. Elias watched all of it with a quiet awe he didn't speak. He saw the scars that lined her skin, the shadows that haunted her eyes, and yet, when he looked at her, he did not see what she had been forced to endure. He saw only the woman standing before him, stubborn enough to survive, brave enough to laugh again. And maybe that was what love truly was on the frontier. Not vows or rings or church bells, but two broken souls choosing day after day to stay. But peace was fragile. One morning, Elias heard it again, the sound of hooves, faint, distant, too many to count. He stepped onto the porch, Winchester in hand, his eyes narrowing toward the shimmering horizon. Dust was rising, carried on the wind like a warning. Calder was not finished. The line Elias had drawn, the sacrifice he had made, it was only the beginning. He tightened his grip on the rifle. Behind him, Grace stood in the doorway, framed by the shadow of the cabin. Their eyes met, steady and unflinching. Whatever storm was coming,